Canada is standing at a historical crossroads, facing a geopolitical storm that is threatening to tear up a century of economic integration and shared prosperity with its southern neighbor. For decades, the narrative was simple. Canada and the United States were the closest of allies, the best of friends, and the most integrated trading partners on the planet. But that era is ending, not by choice, but by necessity. The winds of protectionism blowing from Washington have turned into a hurricane, and Ottawa has no choice but to build a new fortress to protect the Canadian way of life. We are witnessing the most significant pressure from Washington in decades, a calculated attempt to use economic leverage as a weapon of political submission. From the looming threat of universal baseline tariffs to the weaponization of the northern border, the rules of the game have changed. Washington is no longer looking for partners. It is looking for concessions. But what if the United States has overplayed its hand? What if the very tools they are using to squeeze Canada are the same tools that will finally force this country to break its addiction to the American market? In this deep dive analysis, we are going to uncover the strategic blueprint currently being drafted in the halls of power in Ottawa. You will understand why the old reliance on the US is not just outdated, but dangerous. We will explore how Canada is pivoting toward a future where our economic survival is no longer tied to the whims of whoever happens to be sitting in the Oval Office. The whole truth of this transition, one that involves high-stakes legal battles, secret diplomatic maneuvers, and a massive shift in global alliances, will be revealed now. What you are about to hear could change the way you see Canada's place in the world forever. The situation is urgent. The rhetoric coming out of Washington, particularly from the camp of Donald Trump and his protectionist advisors, suggests a fundamental shift toward an America First policy that views trade as a zero-sum game. When we hear talk of 10% or even 25% tariffs on all imports, it isn't just a campaign slogan. It is a direct threat to the Canadian supply chain. We are talking about the potential collapse of the integrated automotive sector, the crippling of our energy exports, and a direct hit to the pockets of every Canadian family. But the Canadian government, led by a renewed sense of sovereign urgency, is not sitting idly by. International trade lawyers like William Pellerin have already pointed out that while the US might think they can act with impunity, Canada is partially protected by a web of international laws and the existing framework of the USMCA. However, legal protections are only as good as the willingness of both parties to respect them. When one side decides to ignore the rules, the other side must find a new game. This is why Prime Minister Mark Carney's potential entrance or the current administration's Team Canada approach is so vital. They are preparing to respond with a level of assertiveness we haven't seen since the days of the original NAFTA negotiations. This isn't just about trade. It's about survival. Canada is facing a choice: remain a vassal state to American volatility, or become a truly independent global power. In this video, you will understand the mechanics of this divorce. We will analyze why the US policy is not just wrong but fundamentally self-destructive for the American economy. Let's explore the reality of the border tensions that have been manufactured for political gain. Uncover what's really happening behind the scenes as Canada begins to look toward the Indo-Pacific and Europe with a seriousness that has been missing for 50 years. The era of Canadian dependency is over. This is the beginning of the era of Canadian diversification. But why now? Why has the relationship soured so quickly? To understand the present, we must look at the context of the last decade. Ever since the 2016 election, the stability of the rules-based international order has been crumbling. Canada, which has always been the greatest beneficiary of that order, now finds itself exposed. The United States has transitioned from a global hegemon that provided security and free trade to an inward-looking power that views its closest allies with suspicion. The border, once a symbol of the longest undefended frontier in the world, is now being used as a pawn in American domestic politics. Whether it's the flow of asylum seekers or the tragic crisis of fentanyl, the US is increasingly blaming Canada for problems that are largely rooted in American demand and American legislative failures. This shift in blame is a strategic move to justify protectionist measures that would otherwise be illegal under international law. Let's analyze the first major event: the threat of universal tariffs. If Washington imposes a blanket tariff on Canadian goods, they are effectively taxing their own consumers and destroying the most efficient supply chains in the world. Canadian steel and aluminum are not just exports, they are the building blocks of American infrastructure and defense. When the US attacks these sectors, they are attacking their own industrial base. But the logic of protectionism doesn't care about economic efficiency. It cares about optics. This is where the legal expertise of figures like William Pellerin becomes crucial. Canada has a massive legal arsenal at its disposal, but the strategy is moving beyond the courtroom. We are seeing the Canadian government prepare a mirror image retaliation strategy. If they tax our steel, we tax their bourbon. If they tax our lumber, we tax their tech. But what's worrying is when these factors combine with the broader geopolitical instability. It's not just a trade war. It's a systematic attempt to rewrite the North American maps of power. The second major event we need to examine is the weaponization of energy. For years, the U.S. has relied on Canadian oil and gas to fuel its economy while simultaneously blocking the infrastructure needed to transport it safely and efficiently. The cancellation of Keystone XL was just the beginning. Now, we see disputes over Line 5 inches Michigan and a general hostility toward Canadian energy sovereignty. This is a paradox that cannot hold. The U.S. wants energy security, but it refuses to support its most reliable supplier. This has forced Canada to finally do what it should have done decades ago: look for other buyers. The expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the development of LNG terminals on the West Coast are not just infrastructure projects, they are declarations of independence. By opening up the Asian markets, Canada is telling Washington that its monopoly on Canadian resources is over. We are no longer a captive supplier. But the connection between trade and energy is just one part of the larger picture. What is truly fascinating is the domino effect this is having on global alliances. As Canada pulls away from the U.S. orbit, it is finding a warm reception in other parts of the world. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, and our strengthening ties with the European Union through CETA are the pillars of this new strategy. Canada is positioning itself as the stable alternative to American chaos. While the U.S. fluctuates between isolationism and aggression, Canada remains a committed defender of the rules-based order. This makes us an incredibly attractive partner for countries in the G7 and beyond who are also looking to reduce their dependency on a volatile Washington. Who will be next to be affected? It's the mid-sized powers Germany, Japan, Australia who are watching the Canada-US spat with intense interest. They see in Canada a blueprint for how to stand up to a superpower. The response from the Canadian government has been surprisingly firm. We are seeing a Team Canada approach that transcends party lines, involving premiers, business leaders, and diplomats all working in concert to defend the national interest. This isn't the Canada of old that would politely ask for exemptions. This is a Canada that is preparing for a multi-front trade and diplomatic war. The strategy is clear: make the cost of American protectionism so high that Washington is forced back to the table, but simultaneously build the infrastructure of a post-U.S. economy so that we never find ourselves in this vulnerable position again. The question of whether this will lead to escalation or de-escalation is still up in the air, but one thing is certain: the world order has changed. The unipolar moment where Washington dictated the terms of global trade is dead. In its place is a fragmented world where regional powers like Canada must be more agile, more assertive, and more strategic. What does the future hold? If the U.S. continues on this path of protectionism, we could see a total decoupling of the North American economy in key sectors. This would be painful in the short term, but for Canada, it could be the catalyst for a long overdue economic renaissance. We have the resources, we have the talent, and we have the geographic advantage of being a Pacific, Atlantic, and Arctic nation. By diversifying our trade, investing in our own domestic processing of critical minerals, and strengthening our military presence in the North, Canada can transition from being an American appendage to a sovereign northern power. The strategy currently being whispered in the corridors of the West Bloc in Ottawa is one of resilience and defiance. We are seeing the rise of a new Canadian nationalism, one that is not defined by being not American, but by being a global leader in its own right. The tension is building. Every month brings a new threat from the South, whether it's about dairy quotas, digital services taxes, or border security. But with every threat, Canada's resolve hardens. We are moving toward a period of intense negotiation where everything is on the table. The USMCA review in 2026 will be the ultimate test. Canada must go into that review not as a supplicant, but as a power with options. If the US wants to tear up the agreement, Canada must be ready to walk away and lean into its global partnerships. The risks are enormous, but the potential reward is a Canada that finally owns its own destiny. We are talking about a shift in the global power picture, where the junior partner in North America finally grows up. As we look at the domino effect, we must consider the impact on the Canadian dollar, the housing market, and our internal politics. A trade war with the US would necessitate a massive restructuring of the Canadian economy. We would need to become more self-sufficient in manufacturing and technology. This is already beginning. We are seeing massive investments in battery plants in Ontario and Quebec, not just to supply the US market, but to supply a global market that is hungry for green technology. This is part of the Canadian Fortress strategy. Build the industries of the future here so that we are indispensable to the entire world, not just our neighbor. The question now is no longer what happened to the special relationship. That relationship was a product of a specific time and a specific American mindset that no longer exists. The question now is what will happen next. Will Canada have the courage to stay the course when the pressure from Washington becomes almost unbearable? Will we have the foresight to invest in the alliances that will sustain us for the next century? The end of U.S. dependency is not a disaster. It is an opportunity. It is the moment when Canada stops being a bystander in its own history and starts being the author. The path ahead is fraught with danger, and the economic shocks will be real. But the destination, a truly sovereign, globally integrated, and self-reliant Canada, is worth every struggle. We are watching the birth of a new era. This is not just a news report. It is a chronicle of a nation finding its voice in a loud and chaotic world. The era of the quiet Canadian is over. The era of the strategic, assertive, and independent Canada has begun. As this drama unfolds, we must keep a close eye on the leaders who are steering the ship. Whether it's the diplomatic savvy of the current foreign ministry or the economic vision of a potential Carney administration, the quality of our leadership will be the deciding factor. The Americans are used to getting their way through sheer size and volume. Canada's strength lies in its precision and its patience. We have spent decades learning how to navigate the American system. Now we must use that knowledge to defend ourselves against it. The world is watching how Canada handles this pressure. If we succeed, we provide a template for every other nation that is currently being bullied by larger powers. We prove that sovereignty is not just about a flag and a border, but about economic choice and the courage to say no to an unfair deal. The tension between Ottawa and Washington is more than just a policy dispute. It's a clash of worldviews. On one side, you have a vision of the world based on walls, tariffs, and transactional loyalty. On the other, Canada represents a vision based on rules, diversity of partnerships, and the belief that trade should benefit all parties, not just the strongest. This is the ideological battlefield of the 21st century. By shifting its global ties, Canada is not just protecting its economy, it is standing up for a set of values that are under attack globally. The end of dependency is an act of defiance against the might makes right philosophy that has taken hold of the American political discourse. So, as we see the headlines about new tariffs or border closures, remember that these are not signs of Canadian weakness. They are the birth pains of a new kind of Canadian power. We are decoupling from a partner that has become unreliable. And while the transition is scary, it is the only way to ensure that our children live in a country that controls its own future. The United States will always be our neighbor, and they will always be a major factor in our lives, but they will no longer be the only factor. The world is much larger than North America, and Canada is finally starting to act like it. The diversification strategy is working, the global alliances are strengthening, and the legal frameworks are holding. The pressure from Washington is great, but the resilience of the Canadian spirit is greater. We are witnessing the end of an era and the beginning of a sovereign future. What we are seeing is a fundamental realignment of the Canadian state. It is a pivot that will redefine our military spending, our immigration policies, and our industrial strategy for generations. We are no longer content to be the attic of North America, a quiet place of resources and stability for the American machine. We are becoming a powerhouse in our own right, a hub for high-tech manufacturing, a global leader in environmental technology, and a diplomatic heavyweight that can bridge the gap between the West and the rising powers of the global South. This is the reality that Washington hasn't yet grasped. They think they can squeeze Canada back into a corner, but Canada has already moved to a different room. The door to the old dependency is closing, and the windows to the rest of the world are being thrown wide open. This shift isn't just about economics, it's about our national identity. For too long, we defined ourselves by our proximity to the US. Now, we are defining ourselves by our connections to the world. We are a nation of the Pacific through Vancouver, a nation of the Atlantic through Halifax, and a nation of the Arctic through our northern territories. This geographic reality is finally being reflected in our political and economic strategy. The end of US dependency means the beginning of a truly global Canada. It means we no longer have to wait for permission from Washington to trade with whoever we want, to set our own environmental standards, or to forge our own path in international diplomacy. This is the freedom that the current tensions are forcing us to claim. In the coming months, expect more fireworks. Expect more aggressive rhetoric from the American campaign trail and more emergency meetings in Ottawa. But don't be fooled by the noise. Underneath the surface, the foundations of a new Canadian economy are being laid. The pivot is happening, the ties are shifting, and the era of dependency is being systematically dismantled. Canada is no longer a country that can be taken for granted. We are a country that is reclaiming its sovereignty, one trade deal, one pipeline, and one legal victory at a time. The world is changing, and Canada is not just changing with it, we are leading the way. The question now is no longer what happened to the relationship we once had. The question is how far we will go now that we are finally free to choose our own path. The end of U.S. dependency is the start of the Canadian century, and the truth of that transition is something that will reshape the entire global power structure. Stay focused, because the next move on the global stage belongs to Canada,